Dog. Oh, I'm your host, Eric Gonzalez, with my four-legged companion, K9 Judah. Judah, Mark. Whoop. There we go. Gotta hold the mark because we're on a wobbly table. How are you, buddy? Good? Cool. All right, guys, listen. I did not create the mark concept. I evolved it. What do I mean by that? In the early 1990s, under the mentorship of Omar Mueller, one of few mentors that I highly esteem to this day. When he became my mentor, he was heavily involved in the studio world, in the Hollywood industry, in the movies or what have you. And so when he was mentoring me during that season, I was already doing dog training briefly, but what he was doing with the mark, he was training the dogs to pretty much learn basics or whatever was required on a 18 by 18 platform, slightly elevated off the ground, about 12 inches off the ground. The objective during that time was to train the dog to do certain things on that platform comfortably until they minimized it to the size of a piece of tape, something small. And so the objective of that was to allow the dog to perform on a mark wherever designated so that the dog could be filmed doing an episode, a skit, a scene, or what have you. And so that was the origin of the mark when I was introduced to it. Since I was a dog trainer, I found that there were a lot of requests for how can we keep the dog indoors without having the dog always in the yard. We wanted to enjoy him as a family, or we have the dog confined to a room, or we have the dog confined to the bathroom, because in many instances, the dog was becoming a nuisance. So what I did was, having an understanding of the mark and practicing it at home, I wound up pushing, me personally, the dogs to stay on the mark on a more permanent basis. So what I wound up doing was I wound up training 2 or 3 dogs, and those 2 or 3 dogs that I took time to train, I was achieving success as I was hoping for. And so one thing that I stand by is whenever you're going to establish a matter, you want to make sure you have 2 or 3 witnesses to anything before you proceed with confidence. And so what I did was, after getting a few dogs comfortable on the mark concept, from an individual perspective and then from a group perspective, I started offering the service, taking into consideration the request in hand, which was, how can I enjoy my dog without him being confined? If I got a protection dog, but he's in a cage, or he's in a yard, or he's confined to an area, how can I have a protection dog and enjoy him? So what I did, having dealt with the crate as a modern form of a den, what basically I did with the mark was I eliminated the walls and made it a more modernized type of a den. Now, back in 2007, I wrote a book called Dog Training for the General Public, and back then in 2007, though I wrote it in 2007, I actually published it in 2008. I have a page, I think it's page 68, where I talk about the mark/place. Now, why do I talk about the mark/place? Is because traditional trainers would always use the place command. And the place command was extremely ideal. But the fact that the trainer would use place while the mark industry, was using the mark concept, pretty much a synonymous idea, the way I chose to evolve it was in the format of understanding the distinction between its original use as a place, as, for example, a mat in a corner of a floor, versus the mark. Now, the Hollywood industry had the mark where it was with the same intent. They started on a platform, but then they diminished where the dog was performing on the floor on a piece of tape or what have you. So the dog would have to step on the tape and perform the commands at that location. What I found myself doing was trying to create a distinction between the place and the mark. And so I'm going to convey to you the bite lifestyle as to why we use the mark the way we do versus the place, and why we distinguish the two and how we distinguish the two. So basically what we do is the following. What I found with the place command is that by the mat or the pillow being continuously on the floor, what happens is the dog has a tendency of cheating a lot quicker. In other words, cheating by stretching, maybe laying an arm on the floor versus on the actual mat. So what I found dogs would wind up doing is they would get comfortable and they would stretch. Next thing you know, that half an hour, 2 hours passed by. Sometimes the dog was completely off the mat, and or maybe feet away from the actual mat. And why? It's basically because they had what you would call that comfort zone of, since I already touching the floor, why not just take it as far as I want? So what I found myself doing in distinguishing the mark from the place was the elevation. The elevation, what I like about the elevation, that it confines the animal in a higher perspective without injury, obviously. In other words, it's not so high where the dog is going to fall off of it or what have you. Even if the dog is sleeping and kind of rolls off, it's a very short distance, and so there's no concern for injury or anything like that. So what I found, like even when dogs are on the marks, a lot of times they'll hang their paws off. And there are times where, if not careful, some dogs larger than others will wind up touching the floor. And that's something that I myself don't even allow, because as with the mat concern or the place command, where the mat is on the floor, I don't want to give the dog no inclination that the floor, which I pay rent for or a mortgage for, that it has a privilege to be there without permission. That's very important. I stress that so much, like even when I'm dealing with a playpen or what have you for a dog, what I don't like about the playpen, me personally, is that even though the playpen confines the dog to a specific area, unfortunately, the area that the dog is confined in, it's an area that's similar to the other parts of my living room. In other words, on my floor in general. For example, I have the dog in the kitchen, in the living room, or what have you, confined in a playpen. What tends to happen is, because the dog will make some mistakes in that designated area, the fact that that tile in that portion of the house where the dog is confined is similar and or the same as the tile across the room, it becomes a problem. It's like saying, I'm going to take a toy and I'm going to let him tear it up. The problem with that is that he'll look at the pillow that's on the couch that's a similar type of material and tear it up and destroy it. Why? Because you've given him the toy at will. And so he's under the impression, well, that is not initiating play. He's letting me do what I want. Let me grab the pillow off of the couch and let me tear it up. So for example, if I take a toy and I play with it and I take the initiative of playing, and he only knows to play with it when I initiate the play, what he'll wind up doing is looking at the pillow on the couch and be like, okay, I'm waiting for that to throw. He's going to throw it soon. But since that doesn't throw it, the dog doesn't touch it. It's the same thing with the floor. If the dog is making mistakes in certain parts of the house because he's confined, but in the other areas of the house is similar tile or floor, what have you, you're going to have the same problem. So I don't like animals to be in my domain, which I pretty much pay rent or mortgage, as I said. So basically what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to get the dog off of my ground and confine him to his own environment. Remember, they're den-oriented creatures. This is nothing more than a den. This mark right here only knows Judah, in the sense that when Judah jumps up here, his scent is the only scent that he'll be familiarized with, therefore allowing the mark to be like that bad concept or his personal domain. If I go to anybody's home right now, most likely you're going to have a room. If you have children, most likely they'll have their own room. Relatives or what have you, everybody will be designated to their own personal domain. And so the mark is nothing more than a den concept where I'm giving the animal his own environment. Remember, when a dog comes home, when a child comes home from the hospital, you can, by law, you can only take the child home if you have a car seat. The car seat will be synonymous to like a mark concept, something that's exclusively for that child and or the mark for that dog, okay? When that child goes home, understand this principle. When the child goes home, he's transferred from what? He's transferred from the car seat to maybe like, what do they call, playpens, like a crib or what have you. So you have playpens, you have cribs, Eventually they have their own room. Eventually they have their own apartment. Eventually they have their own house. And so we gradually raise the child under the, with an understanding that they have their own domain. It's no different with the dog. The problem, because they're four-legged creatures and they're known to, run wild in the wild. What happens is we have a tendency of getting these dogs and simply just letting them be, letting them run, letting them do whatever they want. That's a problem, because dogs in general, canines, are generally pack animals. And so what happens is, as a pack animal, they want to make sure that they eventually run their own pack. So you want to make sure that you don't give the dog the liberty to feel like I could do whatever I want. One of the biggest things to remember about your relationship with your dog, that your dog will most likely spend more time at home than you will. In other words, when you go to work, that animal is home. When you go to school, most likely the animal is at home. Contingent is a service dog or something like that. But in general, the general public have dogs that the dog is going to primarily be confined to that property. Some dogs are left in the yard. Some dogs are left in the bathroom. Some dogs are left in the room. Some dogs are left to just run rampant in the house. So what happens is, consider this logic. If I go to your home and I tell you what to do, I'm a visitor, and I tell you what to do, you're going to look at me like I'm crazy. You're going to look at me like, wait a minute, there's a problem here. Who are you? So the dogs go through a training that I call psychological training, which is with the same principle. Since you're constantly in and out of the house throughout the day, you tend to be a visitor on a day-to-day basis. That's why when you get home, there's a lot of excitement. Hey, come here, how you doing? Now, obviously, they don't communicate like we do. They don't give high fives or what have you. They communicate by jumping on you, barking and whining or what have you, right? So that's how they communicate. I had a client one day call me and they say, hey, listen, I have a dog that is urinating on our dining room table, on the dining room table. So I go, okay, it was a Yorkie. I go to the home. When I get to the home and I inquire about, their concerns or what have you, I find that they're leaving the animal in a designated area, which is a kitchen/dining room area. Because of the space, they're putting a gate up so that the dog can remain confined. And mind you, they own their own business, so they're gone 12, 14 hours a day. By the time they get home, what they were doing was they were putting themselves in a position to have dinner, and then they were telling the animal to pretty much get away. They were shooing the animal away. What happens is that the dining room table was in the area in which the dog was being confined for so many hours. See, the dog doesn't understand that we pay rent, mortgage, and we bust our ass to have the things that we have. The dog doesn't understand that they're creatures of nature. You understand what I'm saying? So because they're creatures of nature, basically what happens is the following. You leave for so many hours, you come back, you're dictating. And how does in general, how does a dog mark their territory? Primarily, they'll mark their territory by urinating or doing something out of character that's usually a nuisance unto us. Okay? So it's important to understand these things when dealing with your dog and you're dealing with his space. All right? Now, when I train an animal, like I can train, the way I've trained Judah, I can leave and come back, he'll still be on the mark. Now, it takes about 3 years to create that push button machine. So what we do as trainers, we set a foundation. When a dog comes here for a mark training scenario, what have you, as part of their training, when they go home, they'll be able to do two things. Remain on the mark while the owner is present. At the same time, at nighttime while the owner is sleeping. Why? Because the owner remains present. Now, obviously, like everything, they're like children. They're going to see what they can get away with, especially when the drill sergeant is no longer around. They're going to see how far they can go. Our relationship, me as a drill sergeant and the client, is usually like that daddy and that mama relationship, or the good cop, bad cop. As long as the bad cop is not around or daddy's not around, the animal will go as far as probably pushing his boundaries with certain members, usually like the wife or what have you, being a weaker vessel, you know what I'm saying? So it's usually the case. Don't let me call dad, and then the child does his part. And so that's where we're at. I have the hand here who's actually has a dog in training, and he had a question for me. What was the question you had, so we can make it a real-time situation for the people that are viewing? All right, so he's asking a question about leaving the dog on the mark outside. Eventually, I would allow it. Immediately, I wouldn't. The reason I wouldn't allow it immediately is for the simple fact that when a dog first go home, they're normally going to go out of their way to see what they can get away with. So remember, since training or that push button machine, it takes about 3 years to create. When I take a dog or I bring a dog home, I'm going to allow the dog to remain on the crate during my presence, whether I'm awake or whether I'm sleeping. So normally what I would do in that scenario is, if I am going to leave for several hours at a time, because in the beginning it's fairly new, what I would normally do is I would still confine the dog to a crate environment. Remember, the crate is nothing more than a modern form of a den. All right? So what we did was, all we did with the mark was eliminate the walls, but it's the same principle and the same concept. Okay? What size of a mark should we put the dog on? It's just like a cage. Whenever you buy a cage, they usually tell you to buy a cage conducive to the size of the animal. Sometimes they'll sell you a big cage with dividers so you could gradually grow the dog into the space. And why is that important? Is because it allows the potty training situation to be resolved a lot sooner. Why? Because dogs don't like to, defecate or what have you, urinate where they're residing. So if I have a small dog, like a toy dog or what have you, the toy dog is primarily going to be on a platform conducive to a size, will probably be about an 18-inch by 18-inch platform, which is 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. A dog that's about the size of a medium-sized dog, well, let's say not a toy dog, but let's say slightly larger, but considered small, it would be a 2x2, 24 inches by 24 inches. If I have a dog that's a little bit larger, 2 feet by about 3 feet, and or larger, 2 feet to about 4 feet in dimensions. However, based on certain dogs, we want to make sure that if we have to customize it, then we'll customize the contingent, the dog requires it. Like I deal with dogs sometimes that are, 150-pound dog, mastiffs or what have you. I may do an exception and do a 4x3. Instead of a 4x2, I normally do a 4x3 to make sure that the dog is comfortable and it doesn't easily roll off or what have you. All right. Recently we've gone as far as adding a backing to the mark for the simple fact that 2 reasons. First and foremost, some people don't want to necessarily put the mark against a wall, and the reason in part is because no matter how clean the dog is or what have you, if you have white walls, it's gonna stain those walls, and it's gonna be kind of like an uncomfortable situation, especially if you're an OCD type of person when it comes to cleanliness. So we put the wall for the purpose of allowing the dog to lean up on something. You can also use it for potty training situations where you can put wee-wee pads on it. I think there's a picture of the wee-wee pads where there's a dog on a mark with a wee-wee pad, because a lot of times you can get the dog to use that as a bathroom, and or if not a wee-wee pad, a backboard with the same principle, because a lot of dogs like to elevate. So it just depends on the scenario in which how you want to use it will determine the best means of using it to resolve those concerns, if at all any. You don't find it? All right. It's a little Frenchy. Okay, you probably didn't receive it. No problem. All right. Anyway, you get an idea. So basically what it is, depending on the size of the dog, I'll put a wee-wee pad probably halfway on the mark to get the dog, especially if you get a dog that's kind of like doesn't care. Maybe what happens is a lot of times dogs come to you and they don't come potty trained. They have to go through a period of or a season, and they want to go into a mark type of training. You want to make sure to add a wee-wee pad partially, not completely on it, but partially, where the dog can sleep comfortably in one area and then urinate in another area, especially these little toy dogs that are not easily attainable to like take outdoors or what have you, or very finicky, they're lap type dogs. Those are the type of dogs that I would really push that with more than anything, not necessarily large breed, even if it's a puppy. All right. So when it comes to the mark, we already covered everything we needed to cover pertaining the foundation or what have you. It's a very powerful tool, potty training or what have you. And again, it's a den-oriented environment for the animal because the animal's pores are conducive to the mark. I had several clients, where I find that their dog urinates on their bed. Can you imagine that? Your dog urinating on your bed where you sleep, when you're intimate, where you're supposed to be at peace? Well, yes, it happens, and it happens often. I'm going to tell you why. It's because a lot of times the owner allows the dog to reside with them in the bed. The problem with that is your body makes up what we call a bouquet of odors. It's everybody has a unique fingerprint of who they are as an individual, right? And so what happens is when you're sleeping, your pores, sweat, this, that, or whatever, they're constantly being released from your body and they're remaining on your bed. So if your dog is sleeping on the bed, how many of you wake up, run to the bathroom, and come back and your dog didn't follow you? The dog remained there a little more comfortable than you yourself were. Can you relate to that? Well, a lot of people do that. And so what happens is it's the same principle when you're leaving and you're going to work. The dog is constantly in that environment. When you're getting up and going to the bathroom, getting some coffee or having coming back to bed with your dog there, it's the same thing. You're allowing the animal to have more possession of your environment, your personal mark, rather than their personal mark. And so what happens is, if you start pushing the animal inappropriately, they'll start urinating again to mark territory. They usually do such things to mark territory. They don't do it because there's a tree coming out of your bed, a tree coming out of your dining room table. They do it because of the miscommunication, or what we call handler errors, that occur that allow the dogs to believe certain things that are not true. I don't allow dogs personally on my bed or on my couches or anything like that. Why? Because at the end of the day, if I allow the dog on the couch on a day-to-day basis, what happens is when I have company and my company comes and sits down and they're hanging out with me, we're drinking tea, we're doing whatever, during that period in which that person is visiting me, their pores are being released. And so what happens is when the person decides to get up and leave, now the animal finds a unique odor there, and to remind that unique odor, they'll urinate to let that unique odor know that they dominate that space. So this is why I don't allow dogs to sleep or hang out on my personal furniture that I sweat to obtain. All of that is privilege. Now, there are a few of you out there that allow such, and so be it. If you're going to do that, make sure that you allow the dog to never initiate that gesture. Always invite the dog. If you're going to do it, which I don't agree with it, but if you're going to do it, make sure you initiate it and don't allow them to take the initiative to do it. I kill initiation and anticipation. What is that? Initiation is the dog grabs a ball, brings it to your feet, drops it, expecting you to play with him. If you do, the dog has you trained. Another thing is I open the dog anticipates what's going on, it runs out without permission, all right? So we don't allow that. So don't allow the dog to jump on your furniture, what have you, independently. That's a bad habit that you're starting and you don't realize it. For such reason, since the dog is not allowed on the furniture, whether it be the sofa, whether it be the bed or what have you, I would suggest, highly suggest, a mark that's elevated off the ground, a substantial amount of space. Matt, look at this, consider this right here. He's off. He's elevated, but his tail is still not touching. Mind you, he has a pretty long tail. You're going to have dogs that have longer tails. But look at this. There's no touching. Even if I touch, he's going to feel it. See how he tenses up? So the minute he touches anything, he's going to tense up. So I like to elevate my mark high enough where it's not going to be any harmful. It's not going to be harmful for the animal. Contingent, he falls. But at the same time, he's high enough where he can't touch anything. Is that us? Okay, sorry. There's a truck outside apparently. And so it's making a noise that I'm not sure if it's interfering with us or not. Okay. Look at the screen. If you see the screen, that screen shows the larger the dog, the higher the mark will be made. So that was a customized mark that I had made for the simple fact that the dog was such a large dog. That's a dog that easily exceeds 150 pounds. And because of it, we have the dog slightly in a higher mark to prevent any touching or what have you that we're trying to deprive the animal of doing. All right. If you look at the other marks that are displayed, this is just to show you. Whereas Judah is on the elevated mark, and that's just a mark stacked on top of another mark. And again, for space purposes, rather than having them dispersed, you can stack them if you got multiple dogs, and it would be more conducive to have the larger dog on the bottom, because the smaller dogs, the higher they are, the less tendency they'll have to jump. But in this situation, I think the smaller dog got the better of Judah, and so got its way. All right. There you go. We're just having fun with the animals, and basically what we're having there is a couple of dogs hanging out together. Mind you, none of these dogs will get off of the mark at any given time. All right, because they were all trained to remain on the mark. You have a few more slides there before we tune out. Let's see what we got. That's my other dog. In the future, he'll be popping up here as my co-host. Judah is my primary. He's my backup. And this is also to show that we also train smaller dogs as well. But this is Baruch. Baruch hanging out. Now, Baruch is hanging out on a skateboard, and the command is no different. Again, he's off the ground. That's not a permanent mark that I would do it. That was actually to get him accustomed to learning how to skateboard. He knows how to skateboard a little bit or what have you. And so what happens is, once you train a dog to mark in their designated area, you can use it as a command when you want them to elevate on anything, whether it be a skateboard, a chair, into your car, what have you. You mark him and he'll go right into it because he's already used to the elevation, the leap. All right. That being said, listen, we already exceeded our time. We went beyond 20 minutes. I just wanted to kind of give you a perspective of the mark, how I started using it, how I evolved it in the industry. It's a very powerful tool. There's much more to be said, that I'm actually writing a book right now, an additional book. It's not so much in this book like I want. This is just an introduction of it on page 68. Dog training for the general public. I'm working on another book, and I go more into the power of the mark because how valuable it has turned out to be throughout my 20 plus years in the industry since I've been doing it. Before I finish, I wanna conclude by saying thank you to the South Florida community, primarily for going down to thus far at West Palm Beach and wiping them out completely from all dogs. During this time, it's such a stressful time that a lot of people are getting these dogs for therapeutic purposes, for companionship, and a lot of them are getting it for protection purposes because 98% of the criminal element will deter properties where there are four-legged companions that bark and intimidate, all right? So that being the case, next week, tune in. We're going to be talking about protection in a more in-depth manner. We talked about it briefly in the COVID-19 video, but I want to go more in depth because lately we're getting a lot of phone calls for the sake of protection because of, the stress of everybody being confined, and so everybody's needing that level of protection. Listen, safety is priceless, right? We spend many of dollars when it comes to alarm systems and for your car, for your home, this, that, or whatever. What we found in the industry, what was found when I was overseas, and I was a private contractor, I was a kennel master for a company. One of the things that came out in the military newspaper during my tenure of being overseas, this was in 2010, 2011, that with all the money that they put into technology for detections of bombs, this, that, or whatever, they found that dogs exceeded technology by 30%. What I mean by that is, what they found is that technology is only a 50% ratio in which it was successful. In other words, 50% of the time it achieved its goal, 50% it didn't. When it came to comparing that technology with your canine, the canine exceeded the technology by 30%, meaning they were 80% proficient in detecting the chemical compounds or what have you when it came to detection or what have you. That says a lot. That speaks volumes when it comes to when you compare the abilities of a four-legged companion to technology. That's very important to remember because it's a broad spectrum in everything. You know what I'm saying? Whether detecting bombs, drugs, when it comes to security in general, sometimes you have to break something for your alarm to go off, whether it be the window of your car, the window of your home, whereas the dog is already attentive and alert by visual and or by scent and or by sound. So by that alone, it allows the dog to deter the threat before it even touches your property. If the dog is triggered to start barking, allowing you an opportunity to go get a weapon or what have you, or call 911 or whatever you feel the need to do. So at the end of the day, these dogs are very valuable. I want to, again, thank the South Florida community for really, you know what? You're showing a level of compassion and a love for an industry that I've spent over 20 years investing in. So when you go out there and you adopt an animal and you keep it from being euthanized or what have you, it's a beautiful thing. I'm here to support. And you know what? I'm willing to do something. The first person that comes to me, the first person that comes to me that can show proof that they rescued a dog from the West Palm Beach kennel, I will give you a 50% discount on any of the packages we have. I don't care what it is. 50%. Why? Because I am so proud of the South Florida community. I want to bless at least one person. If I could bless but one person, I feel like I've given back, and I'm about giving back. All right. Next week we will be talking more in depth, and I'll be tuning in more on the security side of things. What is it? So I have a question. Cindy asks us a question about a mark being utilized by 4 dogs. I personally have a problem with that only because every animal, every person, every child should be afforded their own den environment, their own room, their own crib, their own playpen. You feel me? Why? Because you're playing on scent. And so what happens is when you got 4 dogs, you're gonna get to the point where you're gonna get a challenge that's gonna be unbecoming, especially knowing you personally, Cindy, knowing that you have a lot of dogs that are, somewhat in the working category or what have you, are very tenacious, such as, or could be considered tenacious to many. A lot of these bulldogs or what have you. You want to make sure to give them their own individual space. As a matter of fact, can you pull up real quick the one that I have with the multiple dogs at the same time? I think there's 7 dogs on the mark. Let me see. I have 3 large dogs. Do we have it there? You didn't receive that one either? All right. Well, I have a photo where I have 7 dogs, and you have 3 large dogs and 4 small breed dogs, Chihuahuas, what have you, Frenchies. And what happens is they're all on their own respective marks. Why? Because again, each dog has their own odor, and if this dog's been here the longest and another dog invades his space, he might get out of character in defense of his personal space. So you want to make sure that each dog has their respective location, their respective den. It's like, for example, would you put 4 dogs in one cage? No, you wouldn't do that. So I would suggest have a mark for each individual dog. All right? Listen, again, we passed our time. We're probably, 30 minutes in? So how long? 30. We're 32 minutes in. We're 12 minutes beyond our desire. We want to make sure we keep your attention. We want to make sure you don't get bored. So we want to keep it at about 15, 20 minutes. We went a little bit longer. I felt the information needed to be said. And so we're going to leave it here. Please DM me personally. Follow us on BiteLife_Canine and or Let Your Dog Talk, or LYDT on either Instagram. DM us, ask us questions. I do recall there was one question that was asked to me via Instagram, and the question was, here's the question, and again, I just gotta say it because it was asked. The question was, do I give the dog a treat on the mark, or should I call the dog off the mark for the treat? And I would say it depends what you're doing. I would do both, actually. If I'm training the dog on the mark, the dog's gonna get treated and rewarded on the mark. But if I'm calling the dog to me and the dog is in its beginning stages, where the dog needs to come to me or what have you, I want to make sure that when the dog comes to me, that the dog is encouraged and receives a reward, whether it be a toy and or food or what have you. And we'll talk about that eventually. The difference between a stationary reward and a mobile reward. We'll eventually do that. We'll probably do that following the mark, what have you. Following the protection schedule program for next week. So it just depends. Depending on your question, will determine what class I do. So listen, feel free to ask questions about anything. If I got to double back and talk again about certain different things that we already talked, I'll find angles to bring new, fresh information pertaining what's in my personal arsenal. All right. So yes, when dealing with treat, you want to treat on and off of the mark depending on the command that's required at the moment. So yes for both. All right. So we're tuning out YouTube. Check us out again. Next week we'll be tuning in. And here's the hand. I can never say bye without introducing the infamous hand, the engineer. So listen, tune in next week and we'll keep you guys posted with personal protection, difference between law enforcement protection as well as sport protection or what have you. We'll definitely go in on that and you'll get a lot out of it, especially during a stressful time as